Hey everybody, today we're going to be looking at the Cold War, containment, and Vietnam. Looking at the years 1945 to 1973. It's important to understand though that the Cold War continues until 1991, but we're just going to look at the policy of containment and how that related to Vietnam and the end of containment. So the overarching essay question is discuss the background leading to and the 5 phases of the Cold War from 1945 to 1973. Identify how the Cold War was the result of shared responsibility between the United States and the Soviet Union, and identify how the Vietnam War was a byproduct of the Cold War. Finally, discuss the challenges the Vietnam War posed for American society as identified by Martin Luther King Jr. So concept 1, discussing the origins of the Cold War. So the Cold War is the story of two great powers, the United States and the Soviet Union, the USSR, with a set of expectations as how the other should behave, which neither was willing to fulfill. The question, who started the Cold War, really has no meaning at all. The important question is why did it happen? It's impossible to understand the dynamics of this conflict without keeping in mind the stage on which the opening act began in 1945. So in 1945, the Soviet Union and the United States renewed mutual hostility that had started back in 1917 with the founding of the Soviet Union from the Bolsheviks' revolution. But by 1945, each country perceived the other as having gone back on promises and posing a major military threat to national security. Russia's need for a buffer zone in Europe to uphold Soviet communism clashed head-on with American traditional belief in national self-determination as well. It also clashed with the view held by Americans that the United States should have free access to the world's market and raw materials and exert dynamic leadership over world trade. So that's at the seat of the conflict of why it explains the paradox. The United States will claim that other countries should have self-determination, but when it comes to communism, there's no way that communism can exist in the world from the standpoint of the United States. It's just because it closes off potential markets to capitalist societies, labor markets, resource markets. If the state owns and controls all of the resources, labor and natural resources within that geographical space, right? So capitalism must be able to move from place to place. Practically speaking, we can see this when a business decides or a corporation decides to move its factories from one place to another, right? Because they're in search for cheaper resources and cheaper labor. The United States emerged from World War II and as the most powerful nation in the history of the world. By almost any historical definition, the United States was supreme. It also alone possessed the secrets of the atomic weapon. The United States military forces were located on every inhabitable continent and took permanent control of much of Japan's Pacific Empire in the form of strategic trusts. The war, which had brought all other participants to economic ruin, victor and vanquished alike, victor and loser alike, had restored the American economy after the Great Depression and left the United States in a position to manage the reconstruction of the world economy. The dollar was now the global currency of the United States, or not of the United States, of the world, and the United States was the the number one banker, the number one creditor, and the number one consumer of all resources in the world. The leader of what soon came to be known as the free world, with 6% of the world's population, swiftly proceeded to eat, use, or consume each year more than 50% of the world's resources to feed its expanding industrial base and affluent consumer economy. The picture of the Soviet Union in 1945 could not provide more of a contrast than that of the United States. With up to 20 million of the Soviet Union's 20 million dead within the Soviet Union, its relatively primitive industrial facilities were largely ruined, and territorial lands were wasted by 4 years of scorched earth policy of Hitler. The Soviet Union, having purchased survival at the great price, was weak and vulnerable. It was the second leading power in the world, but that kind of demonstrates how bad off the rest of the world was, rather than demonstrate the true strength of the Soviet Union. Soviet troops, though, did remain in the Middle East, but again, the Soviet Union was on shaky grounds. The United States entered the post-war era with a well-developed imperial creed. The United States declared President Truman in 1945 that the United States would take the lead in running the world in the way the world ought to be run. This is kind of the shorthand of the Truman Doctrine. As a result of this imperial creed, the Truman administration saw nothing contradicting about insisting on the very rights for the number one power that would deny the number two power. American diplomats saw nothing wrong with a double standard and believed that the Soviet Union ought to behave in accordance with the new balance of power in the world, and expected that the military superiority that the atomic bomb had brought it together with America's economic strength would ensure a properly cooperative Soviet policy. But Stalin lost no time, who was the leader of the Soviet Union at this time, lost no time in signaling his unwillingness to play the role assigned to him by American diplomats. This double standard was justified in the same way as the imperial creed by the fact that the United States must now seek the world as a trustee for civilization. So a big contrast to the way the United States viewed itself prior to World War II. Now the United States would see itself as the trustee for world civilization from that point all the way up to this very second. The basic tenet of this new imperial creed was anti-imperialism. The United States sought power supposedly not to perpetuate the selfish policies of the old colonial powers, but to organize the peace and to impose international law. Hence, World War II finalized a revolution in American foreign policy that started with the Spanish-American War, ending 2 centuries of isolation in the world and in diplomatic affairs. During the events leading up to and including the Spanish-American War, the United States' appetite for a larger policy in world affairs developed. This appetite and desire subsidized somewhat for the Spanish-American War and World War I, but became very strong again in 1945. Before World War II, the United States had no formal alliances, no troops stationed on foreign soil, and only a small defense budget. In 1945, the United States willingly sought a lasting, indeed dominant role in international affairs. Consequently, a state of permanent mobilization had characterized American society ever since. The defeat of Germany and Japan did not bring stability to the world, however. Within 2 years of the end of World War II, the United States was engaged in a global ideological struggle with the Soviet Union that historians call the Cold War. The United States government developed a Cold War mentality characterized by a fear of communist expansion and a tendency to interpret all revolutionary activity as part of a monolithic communist movement controlled by Moscow. On the other hand, the Soviet Union developed a fear of capitalism and its tendencies towards the creation of economic slaves. Hence, the Soviet Union viewed American economic and political initiatives throughout the world as a threat to its security. Stalin emerged from World War II resolved to preserve the Soviet state in what he believed to be even more hostile environment than before the war. Suspicious by nature that the Nazis were only the latest of a wave of foreign invaders that had ravaged the Russian soil throughout Soviet history, aware that a fundamentally anti-Soviet capitalist state had become the giant among nations, Stalin became obsessed with the question of national security. Hitler was the only man Stalin had ever trusted, and he betrayed Stalin and almost cost him his empire. So that was his lesson learned from World War II. The conflict between the United States and the Soviet Union began gradually, but as mentioned, the United States had refused to recognize the Bolshevik Revolution government in Moscow until it was 16 years old in 1933 under FDR. More important, the Soviet suspicions of the West began to become very strong in 1942 and in 1943, when the British and the United States twice delayed in opening up a second front against Germany, while the Red Army paid a ghastly price to roll the Nazi invaders back across Russia and Eastern Europe. So for 2 years, 1945 to 1947, after World War II, the nations tried to adjust their differences over, one, the division of Europe, post-war economic aid, and the atomic bomb through discussions and negotiation. So the division of Europe, the fundamental disagreement was over who would control post-war Europe. The Russians, mindful of past invasions from the West, were intent on imposing communist governments loyal to Moscow in the Soviet sphere. The Soviet Union consolidated its grip on Eastern Europe in 1946 and in 1947. One by one, communist regimes replaced coalition governments in Poland, Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria. Moving cautiously to avoid provoking the West, Stalin used communism as a means to dominate half of Europe, both to protect the security of the Soviet state and to advance its international power. The climax came in March of 1948, when a coup in Czechoslovakia overthrew a democratic government and gave the Soviet a strategic foothold in Central Europe. The division of Europe was an inevitable outgrowth of World War II. Both sides were intent on imposing their values in areas liberated by their troops. The Russians were no more likely to withdraw from Eastern Europe than the United States and Britain were from Germany, France, and Italy. A frank recognition of competing spheres of influence might have avoided further escalations of tension. But the Western nations, remembering Hitler's aggression in the 1930s, began to see Stalin as equally as dangerous, a dangerous threat to their well-being. Instead of accepting him as a cautious leader bent on protecting Russian security, they perceived him as an aggressive dictator leading a communist drive for world domination. So you have these kind of misperceptions of each's intentions from the Soviet Union and the United States, and these misperceptions are leading to the development of the Cold War. Post-war economic aid. World War II had inflicted enormous damage on Russia, the Soviet Union. The brutal fighting had taken between 16 to 20 million Russian lives and destroyed over 30,000 factories and tore up 40,000 miles of railroad track. The industrialization that Stalin had achieved at such great sacrifices in the 1930s had all been set back. Even agricultural production had fallen by half during the war. Outside aid and assistance were vital for the reconstruction of the Soviet Union. American leaders knew that knew of Russia's plight and hoped to use it to its advantage. Wartime Ambassador Averell Harriman wrote in 1944, the economic aid was, quote, one of the most effective weapons at our disposal in dealing with Russia. Truman was convinced that economically, quote, we held all the cards and the Russians had to come to us. In 1945 of January, the Soviets requested $6 billion in loans to finance post-war economic reconstruction. Despite initial American encouragement, Roosevelt deferred action on this request as relations with Russia cooled. And under Truman, he completely dismissed the request altogether. While at the same time the United States rubbed salt on the wounds of the Soviets when it abruptly terminated vital Lend-Lease aid to the battered Russian and spurned Moscow pleas for the $6 billion loan. It gave a similar loan of $3.7 billion to Britain. Deprived of American assistance, the Soviets were forced to rebuild their economy through reparations. The Soviets systematically removed factories and plants from areas they controlled, including their zone of Germany, Eastern Europe, and Manchuria. Slowly, the Soviet economy recovered from the war, but the bitterness over the American refusal to extend aid convinced Stalin of Western hostility and thus deepened the growing antagonism. So, again, just to kind of recap that, Soviet Union is completely devastated by the war. They seek economic aid from the United States, asking for loans, things that they were willing to pay back. And the cards that the United States was holding was, okay, sure, we'll lend you money, open up your borders to our corporations, open up our borders to potential business, which in a sense would mean give up communism, right? And so either side cannot comply with either of those. And so this economic aid is going to become a serious issue, and it's going to, again, develop towards Cold War. Finally, the atomic bomb is the last component in the development of the Cold War. The inability to reach agreement on international control of the atomic bomb greatly added to the mounting tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union. With the successful use by the United States in August of 1945 of the atomic bomb at Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the new weapon raised problems and would have been difficult for friendly nations to resolve. Given the uneasy state of the Soviet-American relations, the effect was disastrous. The wartime policy followed by Roosevelt and Churchill ensured a post-war nuclear arms race. Instead of informing their major ally of the development of the atomic bomb in the late 30s and the early 1940s, they kept it a closely guarded secret, obviously. Stalin learned of the Manhattan Project through espionage and responded by starting a Soviet atomic program in 1943, which he completed in 1949. After the war and before the Soviets developed their atomic bomb, the United States wanted to develop a disarmament plan which was based on, one, sanctions by United Nations against violators of the ban of the production of the bomb, inspections, and taking away the veto power of the Big Five, including the Soviets within the United Nations, had in the Security Council on all matters involving atomic energy. The net effect of this plan would preserve the American atomic monopoly for the indefinite future. The Soviets advocated immediate disarmament, hoping to neutralize the United States' advantage. These responses were predictable, and no agreement was possible, obviously. The United States isn't going to give up its weapon, and nor would the Soviet Union or any other nation that had the capability of developing it is going to refuse to develop this weapon. The responses were predictable and no agreement was possible. Neither the United States nor the Soviet Union could abandon its position without surrendering vital national interest. The nuclear dilemma inherent in the Soviet-American rivalry blocked any national settlement. Instead, the two superpowers agreed to, well, simply disagree. Since neither side trusted the other, nor any form of international cooperation was possible, each concentrated on taking maximum advantage of its wartime gains. Thus, the Soviets exploited the territory they had conquered in Europe, while the United States retained its economic and strategic advantages over the Soviet Union. By the end of 1946, the United States' perceptions of the Soviet Union led American diplomats to conclude that it was futile to bargain with the Russians. Instead, they turned to containment, a strategy designed to limit Soviet and communist expansion. As in this containment policy was laid out by George Kennan. Basically, it says that we can't go to all-out war with the Soviet Union to destroy it. The American people won't stomach another total war as World War II was. But we must be committed to containing the spread of communism led by Moscow, Russia, or the Soviet Union. All right, that's concept one. We'll get with concept two, looking at the four phases of containment within the Cold War.